I'm Katerina. Recording in progress. Hi, everyone. I'm Katerina with Psychi External team, and I'll be your host for today's event. Before we continue, however, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We may not be physically on campus, but UBC Psychi operates on UBC's infrastructure, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. Today's event is the UBC Psychi Expert Talk. Psychi is one of the largest international societies in the world with the purpose of providing academic and professional development opportunities to students. And in service of this goal, we here at the UBC chapter of Psychi have developed this Expert Talk series, which is a bi-weekly event where we invite professionals in the field of psychology to share their experiences, advice, and knowledge with UBC students. Today's talk will feature Dr. Michael Gordon, who holds a master's in consciousness and transpersonal psychology from Liverpool John Moores University, and also a PhD in education from Simon Fraser University. He is also, aside from holding a private psychotherapy practice here in Vancouver, Dr. Gordon also is a 6th Dan Aikido teacher with 23 years of experience and is a successful recording and performing singer and songwriter. Dr. Gordon is also notable for speaking at forums, writing about spiritual psychology and daily life, hosting his podcast, The Mind Whisperer, which now has over 20,000 downloads, and his graduate thesis projects focused on exploring the practical and theoretical aspects of teaching, psychotherapy, and Aikido. Today, Dr. Gordon will be discussing his topic, a transpersonal psychology approach to trauma and conflict. Meeting attendees, if you have at any time during the talk have any questions that you would like answered, please feel free to type them into the Zoom chat, and we will be happy to address them during our Q&A section of the event. And without further ado, I'm very excited to hand it over to our amazing speaker of the day, Dr. Michael Gordon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Katerina. Nice to be here. Welcome to everybody. I'm really excited to speak with everyone. And so as I was saying, just in our peremptory conversation with the team here, try and keep this talk, relatively informal and also shorter on the information delivery side. I'm not much on the didactic model of teaching. I like the interactive. So I'd really like to hear from you and make this lively conversation. But I think that some background and insight into my approach and some of the maybe unfamiliar aspects, particularly of transpersonal psychology as being the context of this talk, would be helpful. So let's start there. So transpersonal psychology is something that's probably unfamiliar to a lot of people, even in the psychology field. It's still, unfortunately, seen as some kind of peripheral or a sub category of mainstream psychology. Part of that is because, as we know, the education system, post-secondary system, is driven by research, and research dollars are directed towards clinical research and pharmaceutical research, these kind of things. So when you get down into the qualitative research around treatment outcomes and the well-being of consumers of psychology services, now we're getting down into the efficacy of psychotherapy and other modalities of which might be somewhat influenced by transpersonal psychology. So what is it? Why is it different? I'll give you a brief history today, and then really kind of try and get across how I integrate this approach, or how it's informed me, and actually my path into professional practice in the field. So the university that I did my master's degree in, John Moores University in the UK, was a distance program, and the program exists now, but in a different form. When I discovered the program, it was part of their applied psychology, and there was a Master of Science program, and then they lost funding. And so my professor, who's now an emeritus professor of the university, founded an institute and has continued to do the work that he does, and it's an accredited program, and now it's an adjunct program to the university. In fact, the university, I think, is conferring the degree. So that's pretty cool. And that was in consciousness and transpersonal psychology, consciousness studies. So it covered quite a range of areas and topics of interest. In the UK, the British Psychological Society actually has a transpersonal psychology chapter. And so this is their definition of what transpersonal psychology is. Transpersonal psychology might loosely be called the psychology of spirituality and of those areas of the human mind which search for higher meanings in life and which move beyond the limited boundaries of ego to access an enhanced capacity for wisdom, creativity, unconditional love, and compassion. It honors the existence of transpersonal experiences and is concerned with their meaning for the individual and with their effect upon behavior. A couple of the key researchers and figures in the literature around this area are Walsh and Vaughan. And so in their volume from 1993, they define it as experience the sense of self extends beyond trans, the individual or personal, to encompass wider aspects of humankind, life, psyche, or cosmos. So the kind of phenomena and the areas of interest would include non-ordinary states of consciousness, peak experiences, paranormal experience or parapsychology, psychic phenomena, psychic states, etc., trance states, these kind of things. If we look at development of modern psychology, it bridges a lot of different areas of scholarly research, philosophy being one of them for sure. I would say anthropology, specifically an area called philosophical anthropology, study of the self. And the figures who preceded, the formal establishment of modern psychology as we know it today, or psychiatry, really are the touchstone figures in what turned out to be transpersonal psychology. So as a kind of thematic statement, this is unfortunately a bit of a, you might have heard this in popular usage. We don't really know the true elements of the statement, but we recognize the statement. Some people attribute it to Teilhard de Chardin, some people attribute it to Gandhi, to Dr. Wayne Dyer. Regardless, here's the statement. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience, spiritual beings having a human experience. So even the areas of philosophy, particularly the emerging existential philosophy, movement philosophy, Nietzsche and Husserl and Heidegger, they're all concerned with ontology. And ontology informs psychology, ontology being the study of what is the nature of reality. So these are perennial questions, and indeed they have formed the basis of what we call perennial philosophies. So the perennial philosophies or wisdom tradition of Buddhism and Islam and Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism and so on and so forth emerged around the same kind of period in ancient time, but have lasted over the millennia and inform a lot of our modern thought. And so transpersonal psychology really grounds itself in some of those philosophical, ontological, and what we call soteriological concerns. Soteriological is a big word, but what it means is that it's kind of a moral-driven outcome, not necessarily in terms of divinity or theology, in terms of well-being, right? So the brief history, really, again, kind of in the modern era, we start with figures like James, Carl Jung, of course, in depth psychology, quite a peripheral figure, at least outside of transpersonal psychology, but a really important thinker and theoretical figure is Roberto Assagioli, and he developed a theory called psychosynthesis. And so, when we talk about transpersonal psychology, we're talking what is known as, not formally, because it's not really recognized as such, but the fourth force in psychology, or the fourth wave of psychology. So we start with depth psychology, Jung, etc. Then we move into behavioral psychology. I'm sure you all know this. And then humanistic psychology in the 50s and 60s. Now that came out of the work primarily of Abraham Maslow and his colleague Anthony Sudich. And I'm sure Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And by the time humanistic psychology was really underway and other figures like Carl Rogers emerged, Maslow and Sudich in particular grew dissatisfied with the limitations of humanistic psychology, the study of the individual, not so much, in the shadow of Freud, that there are universal pathologies, that subjectively each individual has a life path, and this is something that Jung really brought forward, in contention with the subjective meaning of our lives, and this is deterministic and mental as much as anything. And so Sudich and Maslow really looked deeper into this question of meaning self. And at the peak of the pyramid, they went beyond the self-actualization to self-transcendence. So we're back to a question of ontology and psycho-spiritual development, not just psychological development. And so their efforts culminated formally around 1967 in somewhere called the Esalen Institute, which is in Big Sur, California. And they had this meeting, and some of the key figures of this movement, again, names that you might come across or heard of: Stanislav Grof, Fadiman, Mach, Sonia Margulies. They kind of established this manifesto around transpersonal psychology. And as that progressed forward, you have other names like Robert Fraker. Robert Fraker is a key figure because he started the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology. It is now called Sophia University. It's in Palo Alto, California. Gold, of course, author of many books, mainly Emotional Intelligence, a key researcher in neuroscience and consciousness and mindfulness. Stanley Krippner, Charles Tart, Roger Walsh, John Wellwood, and of course Ken Wilber. So if you've ever looked at Wilber's work, he's still somewhat outside academia, but figure in the kind of development of this field. And to really generalize here and put it into rough terms, this is a kind of a wide range of theory and scholarly interest. And what distinguishes transpersonal psychology is this developmental model, which again is psychosocial and psychosocial. And so in terms of life stage, broadly put, the focus around the pre-rational or the pre-egoic, the personal or the egoic self, and then lastly, the post-egoic or trans-egoic self. So we're back to Maslow's idea of ascension to the ego. And of course, this is all a fundamental ontology and philosophy in the wisdom tradition, particularly Buddhism, which I'm most familiar with. The idea of tackling the problem of ego, the ego being something that we identify with as this. And so we're into territory here that is a common problem across psychology, namely this being in the shadow of the Cartesian problem, which is the mind-body problem, but also the mind and brain problem. So in my master's program, this was essentially what was fascinating to me. It's consciousness. Is it epiphenomenal of our anatomy? Is it just something from the structures of our brain? Or is it something beyond that? Is it a phenomenon beyond that? And so when we bring it into the focus of today, which is talking about trauma, well, let's talk about trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is an injury to self, right? So it means wound. And so the wound to self isn't necessarily psychological. It's the overall impact of feeling attacked or limited, or being able to fulfill your full functional self, as Carl Rogers called it, a fully functioning person. And thus healing means wholeness. You didn't know that, so it's quite interesting. So the idea that holistic psychotherapy or holistic approach to the self or holistic approach to healing is somehow out of mainstream psychology, to me it just seems redundant, because it simply just means addressing the fullness of healing. And so in the trauma model, what do I mean? Well, I'm going to kind of delineate that a little bit here. And I'm going to refer a little bit to the differences between mainstream psychology and transpersonal psychology, without getting into the weeds too much here in terms of the theory and there. But let's talk about it in the type of wounding. So on the local level, what we're talking about is psychopathology, right? Or your personal historicity. That's the self, your personality, your personal narrative structure, you derive meaning of who you are and what your life is, your personal relations, your family dynamic, what we call your intrapsychic orientation. Okay. From the transpersonal point of view, we broaden that out beyond just the locality of your circumstances or situation to your what we call your psychospiritual orientation. Who are you in terms of existence and how you frame that existential question ontologically, ecologically. I don't mean in terms of nature, but in terms of the universe, cosmos, relationally. Now that might also involve something called a non-dual worldview. So this is something that's central to a lot of these perennial philosophies. Let's talk about Buddhism, for example. It doesn't recognize the difference between a me, a you, a subject, and an object. So it's completely outside of the Cartesian problem, which is a very materialist point of view, that there is substance in the world, and Descartes delineated that somehow consciousness and mind is, or spirit is outside of the material world. So very, very broadly, as a worldview, as an orientation, transpersonal psychology would say we're not just deterministically the outcome of the polarities of our personal situation or place, that we are part of a whole. All right, so let's talk about conflict or trauma. Again, we talk about the local level. So what does that look like? That looks like, so the negative impact of a conflict is the ego defense. And you've all studied some psychopathology here. So that means that we are defending a sense of self, and that something external to us is threatening that sense of self. And there's many pathways that we go down in defense of the ego or the self, perceived injury. That, from a transpersonal point of view, or from these wisdom, is that the perception of an encapsulated self based on the ego identity is an illusion, because where do you locate that? Where is that in the brain? Where is that in the body? Show me the actual structure of that. So this is really the myth of psychology and psychiatry, that there is a sort of central self. When we talk about disorders or mental illness, how do you identify that? You can talk about neuronal damage or organic pathology in the brain or whatever, but where's the damage to self? There's no tumor that attacks the self. The self is a ephemeral quality. So, and of course, if we talk about on the global level of conflict, we're talking about loss of self-identity, the things that we identify with, how we identify, for example, look at the divisiveness of social media, how it exploits differences and a particularized point of view, and we can see the fruition of that in the world. It's had catastrophic consequences. If the outcome of Brexit, if you look at what's recently happened in the United States with the violent physical attempt at insurrection in the Capitol, that's the QAnon phenomenon. These are heightened social divisions which are stoked, and people become personally embroiled and identified and triggered on an emotional level. I'll say one thing about that in particular, which is some interesting research, that the pain center in the brain is not limited to physical pain. The brain doesn't process on a functional level the difference between emotional pain and physical pain. It's pain in the brain. So the research I'm speaking of particularly was an experiment where they had people who had recently been through a breakup relationship. So the control group was stimulated by a tiny pain stimulus, like a little pinprick. The experiment group stimulated by a random series of in which one suddenly appeared that was the image of their ex-partner. And so they had a random controlled stimulus of disturbance compared with the control, which was physical pain. And so physical pain was all, randomly applied, right? So they had different sensations and all of a sudden a pinprick. And the same area of the brain lit up in an fMRI, which is fascinating. So pain is pain. An injury to self is an injury to self. You cannot, again, going back to this Cartesian problem, neatly, discreetly separate out someone has a psychological problem or they have a physical, problem. Yeah, all of it is, of course, there are physical only problems or that there is an etiology of disease where someone has a tumor, etc. Talking about disorders, we're talking about functional problems. So it brings all kinds of interesting questions up for research and some very interesting interrogations of what psychology and particularly psychiatry is based on. Because how do you then really prove etiology of mental diseases? Because they're mental in nature, unless there's some kind of actual physical pathology going on. All right, not contentious, but I find it fascinating. Okay, so let's come back to a kind of a practice model, like a clinical approach, and this gets to my orientation and something common for transpersonal practitioners. So talking about trauma, right? It could be someone disagrees with my opinion. That could be a sense or conflict, I should say. Trauma could be relational in our interpersonal relationships with people. And it could be something that we carry. And I'll get back into that a little bit, talking about the particular modality I practice, which is EMDR therapy. But from the personal point of view, I want to talk about a different model theory of change to humanistic or even depth psychology. And from Buddhism, we have the word karma. And colloquially, people understand karma to mean payback. Right? Consequence of something that we've done, and so we're suffering as a result of something we've done, which is a misnomer. Karma translates into change or choice. And so from the Buddhist point of view, because Buddhism is based on the idea of impermanence, but also the soul, right? And reincarnation, that there is no fixed self that dies with. And so we are born out of and into conditions that we bring with us. Now, whether you agree with that or not, you could start that clock from the minute we're born. It doesn't matter. The individual circumstances, which Buddhism calls dependent origination, or the way they say things are such that you grow up in a certain family at a certain time, in a certain place, in certain conditions, and therefore you carry certain challenges or disturbances or so on and so forth. So karma means the awakening into with that, which we know from Western psychology to be therapy, for example, psychodynamic therapy, working with your mind, working with another individual to become aware of those challenges and patterns in your own thinking and emotions. But this is a universal project that Buddhism outlines. And Buddhism, as the way I describe it, is not a religion. It actually, across all the different traditions of Buddhism, if you go back to the core of the Buddhist teaching, it is a system of psychological practice. And so going back to the Western originators of, or the forebearers of this transpersonal movement, for example, William James, certainly Carl Jung, they're delving into these old philosophies and practices that go back 2,500 and some even more ancient than that years. And so in Buddhism, it's a psychological practice, through meditation of becoming aware of one's patterns, but not limiting that to me, because that gets you into a circular problem that of identifying with your thoughts, identifying with your emotions, identifying with your problems, which we call pathology. So, kind of pithy way to say that is that Freud said we kind of get to what he called normal neurotic, and the Buddha approach is to say the starting point is actually a kind of universal normalcy, if you will, like an unconditioned approach, non-judgmental approach of self. That the self is already perfect, and it has to grow out of the idea that somehow its value or our worth is conditional. So a very different understanding of what pathology is. Okay, so we continue with the idea that in staying on the theme of the Buddhist psychology, they're concerned with the human project again, or endeavor to be enlightened, which means to be aware and therefore more empathetic, more available in terms of preventing suffering elsewhere in the world or in existence. And that's what we call practice or path. And so what did I write down here? From individualized self, one contracts into the restricted and distorted view from the ego self. So spiritual practice, religiosity or theism or deity or worship per se, is rather seeing oneself on self-development and cultivation of virtue towards wholeness, not just internal wholeness, but wholeness with all existence, all reality. So struggle becomes a universal struggle. I see myself in others and vice versa. It's a reciprocal relationship or ontology model. In terms of practice, it has different orientations. In the one, again, I'm most personally familiar with and steeped in is the Japanese tradition. So in Japanese, it's called do, karate do, right? Judo, Aikido, which means path or way. Another word for that is michi. But there, in the Japanese tradition, all of the arts are a path to working through this fixation on the self and conditional self-worth and separation from everything into integrating wholeness and letting go of that individualized self. So it's discovering oneself through the practice. That is ceramics or calligraphy or archery or flower arrangement, or which is an interpersonal practice. Zen, of course, is about being present. In the present moment, non-judgmentally, completely immersed in the experience of whatever it may be that you're doing. Eating an apple, washing the dishes, whatever it is. All right, so when we bring in the, kind of purpose of philosophy, broadly put, in particular in the Western tradition, really what philosophy's aim is how, or philosophy's aim is how to have a good death, which doesn't mean you defer living, only being preoccupied about how to die, but it's the notion that life is a process of working towards the fruition of the life that lived, which is to die with a good conscience and thinking about the things done and feeling a sense of peace about mortality. It's true in terms of questions for existential philosophy, in philosophy or European philosophy, as it is in any of these wisdom traditions. If we look at another of psychology that kind of didn't stay within the lanes of transpersonal definitions, but more came out of the humanistic psychology, we have Martin Seligman's positive psychology, which I'm sure some of you have studied. And this picks up on these notions of virtue, ethics, and the moral life, which go back to ancient Greece. And so the term eudaimonia, EUDAIMONIA, which means happiness, but it's a different kind of happiness we're used to when we think of, say, Freud and pleasure principle and neurosis and the traps that we fall into. It's, again, in a way, transcending personal aim, the highest point of eudaimonia, or the version of eudaimonia being living a purposeful life, not just being experiencing joy, right, or pleasure. Okay, and I'm conscious of the time here. We're doing pretty good. So I'll talk about how this has informed my own development, and particularly has shaped how I have evolved as a clinician, which has been a somewhat unconventional path compared to some of you who may be starting to become enter into our Masters of Counseling program, etc. I found myself preoccupied with these philosophical and spiritual questions. My Aikido journey preceded my master's degree by over a decade. And so when I came to this program, it was a perfect for me because I wanted to integrate these questions about my own psychological journey, I guess I would say, to be on a healing path with this practice, which is not really a martial fighting art, but an art of learning how to deal with another person or multiple people from a completely different point of view of responding or reacting to conflict, but seeing it in the context of restoring wholeness. Kind of paradoxical, right? That if someone asks you, how can you extend love to that person? This is the paradox of what it's to be actually rid of the preoccupation of defending the self, proving who it is, and therefore when the self feels threatened, to stand up for that self or defend the concept of that self. You are just that self. You're not, so then you are more available and open. In fact, you are, let's just say, more oriented towards empathic attunement. Because remember, our brain, I think the brain is what's called the triune brain, right? The brainstem, limbic system, prefrontal cortex. We are still a default revert back to the evolutionary purpose of or design of the brain in all mammals anyway, which is to scan for threat. So, our psycho development is our actual neuroanatomical evolution is a map, if you will. It's a cartography of how we have evolved socially to not just be totally reactive all the time. Otherwise, we go back to what Hobbes called, life is brutal and short, right? That we're all out in the brutal jungle of the world, and it's the dog. And so Aikido is really this, again, kind of a purposeful virtue based and ontologically based, model of the world, or worldview, that the world is whole, it is balanced, yin and yang, and all of nature has a kind of integral matrix, and we are part of that. And so the practice is to continually do that in the face of being attacked. Okay, so we come finally to talking about my clinical practice, psychotherapy, and the role of the practitioner and the client. And at the same time I started my master's program, I discovered EMDR, and known EMDR as it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This was a clinical modality discovered by accident by the founder, whose name was Francine Shapiro. She's a psychologist in the States. She was going through her own crisis of mortality, diagnosis of cancer. She was a PhD student, I believe, in literature at the time, although she was working for some hypnotherapist, I believe. And so she was walking on campus and very distraught, and her eyes started going back to falling leaves on the ground, on the path, and she started down. And she wondered what that mechanism had to do with her affect regulation. And so through research and developing a protocol, she found that engaging eye movement in a clinical setting by focusing on trauma allows us to process in the moment, in real time, when we are deeply asleep in rapid eye movement, where your body's under actual paralysis, so that you can run from a dragon or a bear, or play out the conflict you had from your childhood or whatever it is, and your consciousness reboots in the morning and you shake it off back to reality. That was a dream, let's say, presuming that's what reality is, and so you have you can and delineate what is, or just distinguish what is past and what is present. So when it comes to really significant episodic trauma, we are only functioning in the moment as much as we are with past events. And if those events are still in us, because that aren't obvious, they lodged in at a time developmentally when we process them, we couldn't contextualize them. That was the job of people around us, called our parents and our parents. We don't realize how that embedded like cognitive distortions and negative emotional patterns and trauma adaptations. I want to make this clear, not just as a value statement on my own, but from the theoretical point of EMDR, they're not adaptations. When you look at trauma, particularly what we now know through research is development trauma, childhood experiences, etc. It's trauma, and that's not what happened. It's the classic model is sort of the diagnostically speaking. Of course, we need to be able to have a taxonomy, right? So who has PTSD, who has complex PTSD, so that we can work with them medically or so on and so forth. But when it comes down to functionally what's going on, the trauma is not something that's located in time. It's located in you. It's what happens in you and what you carry forward. And so, ironically, a lot of my clients arrive thinking they have trauma, but they are disturbed. They have impediments being intimate and open, vulnerable, holding relationships, all the hallmarks of traumatic history. And what we find out is when we tap into those negative affects or those symptoms, we'll go back to experiential memory of trauma. Can't label it as such because they don't have a name for it, and sometimes it goes back to a time when it was not rational, or you're in a child state, a child ego state. And so originally this movement, this valley was developed specifically for serious capital T trauma, combat, stress, sexual assault, kidnappings, these kind of things, witnessing homicide. But since then it has been adapted, and there is at least one practitioner by the name of Laura Parnell who really has earmarked EMDR as a transpersonal psychology practice. And the reason for that is very simple. I have to make it simple to keep this short. But if you think meditation, what we know now from meditation and studies around neuroscience is the ability to observe your own mind in a safe setting has the effect of what's called metacognition or meta-awareness, which is I experience the maelstrom of disturbance in my mind. I'm taught that it's a mental or physical event that's happening outside of any situational danger. I'm just sitting in a room. So as I think myself that it's just the nature of my mind or my psychological process or a phenomenon in my body, I'm actually okay, and I can come back to focus on my breathing or whatever it is. So if you take that, what we call effect of down regulation, that we kind of fall prey to, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, and meditation allows us to see, okay, it's just reacting again from that place of injury, danger, or myself is threatened, or I'm not good, or etc. Core shame. That witnessing aspect, powerful. If you extend that out into the setting, for example, let's stay with meditation. In meditation practice, you have a group practice. So if you sit in a meditation hall or a room, you have other people who are silently meditating, you have a teacher, and so there's safety. There's safety in the container community. In the clinical setting with EMDR, you're bringing up someone's private trauma. It's terrifying. Their trauma is having to suppress their emotion and to be able to be present in every way. And so that's the traumatic. Really, it's not what happened historically. And so as you make space for that and allow something to happen in terms of the processing of the information in a way that reorganizes it, because your brain can actually work properly, the eye movement stops, you're sitting with your practitioner, you're safe, you're not back trapped in a car, and your mind has to integrate the context and temporal, spatial of what's going on. Plus there's someone there holding the space with you. So that witnessing aspect is now twofold, and it has the same effect, not just meta awareness, but it's a relational repair, because you are now going through something and you're not alone. Right? So, excuse me, because of that physiological piece, the mind-body piece of EMDR, and how that's related to my background in Aikido, I completely to this practice, and it's extremely efficacious. It bypasses a lot of the problems of the interpersonal therapeutic alliance. You know, be very tricky. There's transference and counter-transference therapy. People get triggered by the therapist. They go back to their emotional patterns of shutting down, or and it can be very, very difficult, and long-form therapy isn't always effective. This allows the person to reset and bypass ways of those problems that arise in the therapeutic relationship. So I think I'm going to stop there. That's more than enough time. I think I've kind of right at 40 minutes there. That's over. I said I was going to go short. But I'd like to throw it open to questions now, and I'm happy to answer as best I can, or converse with you anything that we've covered or anything else.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. That was a fascinating talk. There's so much to unpack there. So let's get right into the questions that we have from our audience. So everyone, if any of you have any questions you want to ask, you can put your hand up and we'll get to you so that you can ask them verbally, or you can just type them in the chat and I'll read them out loud for you. So we have some questions that have been submitted already, some in the chat and some before the presentation began. So Noor asks, can transpersonal psychology be related to psychedelic psychotherapy?
Very good question, and absolutely yes. Not just transpersonal psychology, certainly transpersonal psychology was the field which I think allowed and in some ways maybe even validated psychedelic psychotherapy and use of psychedelics in therapeutic settings. Of course, we all know that Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, were fired from Harvard for their experiments and jailed, and so they found their own ways out into outside of academia in the use of psychedelics. But they've come back into research and clinical application now, even in BC. There, at least I know of one approved clinical trial of psilocybin in therapy. And I wanted to speak briefly about the relationship between the transpersonal and the psychedelic therapy. So this is what I referred to earlier as non-ordinary states of consciousness. So the idea that we can engage a non-ordinary state of consciousness because it takes us into the transpersonal realm without having to get caught up in what that means and whether that's valid, or the cultural problems around that if the therapist can relate to that or is trying to overlay that onto somebody else. It doesn't really matter. Let's take a really quick aside because a lot of psychological research is about dysfunction examining dysfunction and in fact even inducing dysfunction, and seeing how the brain works or how the mind works. For example, the original research around cutting the connections between the two hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum, and what that allows us to understand about functionality. There is a TED Talk and a really great book by a woman who now I'm not going to remember her name. Someone else might remember her name. Jill Bolte Taylor. And the book is called A Stroke of Insight. This one is a neuroanatomist, and she was in the shower one day and didn't realize until later she was having a full left hemisphere stroke. So what that means is only the right hemisphere of her brain was active. And the right hemisphere is really the dominant hemisphere. It's the first lobe of the brain, or the hemisphere of the brain to develop, because it develops around attachment, around relationship, around basic consciousness, and spatiality, global relations, these kind of things. The left side of the brain is more specifically oriented, logic, information, specific locality, etc. So without that that side of her brain online, she couldn't recognize numbers to dial her colleague to get help, and et cetera, et cetera. But she writes and speaks about the effect, the bliss effect of being only in her right hemisphere. And so you can think about that as a transpersonal experience, because you're not bounded anymore by the constraints of the ego and our personal history and these kind of things. So inducing that effect, getting into a state, a bliss-like state, through a controlled psychedelic trip, is something, for example, with ayahuasca, that people we know derive great benefit from, because they can transcend the physical, emotional, and mental, and even spiritual idea of who they are, particularly in terms of like the neurotic entrapment of their family, and experience themselves unencumbered.
Answer. An excellent question too, Nor. There's been, we've all been hearing lots of great stuff coming out of research with psychedelics, especially with things like anxiety and depression. There's been a lot of research coming out that's showing that it's really, really effective for that. And the connection to transpersonal psychology is also a really interesting point. Then we have Shannon, who is asking, Dr. Gordon, you said that transpersonal psychology draws from existential philosophy. I'm really interested in Irvin Yalom's style of existential psychotherapy, and I was wondering if these two approaches to therapy, those being existential and transpersonal, have much in common in practice.
Very, very good question. I'm familiar with Yalom's work. Yes, and sort of yes. It's entirely dependent on the practitioner and what their orientation of existentialism or existential, being an existential therapist is. Yalom falls probably more into the framework that I've laid out today. Particularly if you're familiar with the latest book, if I'm not mistaken, that he wrote, which is called Staring at the Sun, which is about staring down his own mortality. And he draws particularly on the ancient Greek philosophy traditions, Epictetus and Heraclitus, etc., and the Stoics, as a way of addressing his own struggles around being in the late stage of his own life, coming to terms with that inevitability, and also drawing from his clinical practice with his patients of helping them deal with their fear of finitude, whether it's age-related life stage mortality, illness, or just what Ernest Becker called well, like I said, existential dread, right? And so Yalom's approach is transpersonal in a certain way, because it's seeing yourself in the context of a process of life, right? Of a cycle of life, and an understanding of what the nature is of the human mind, wanting to live forever, So this is something that's shared in common with Buddhist practitioners, for example. But there are also existential therapists who will take a different approach, more akin to the existential philosophers, say Sartre or Camus, which is that, what are you going to do? Life is absurd. There really is no point to anything. And so particularly in terms of Sartre, who talked about good faith and bad faith, it's more along the self-actualization line. I would say it's more akin to humanistic psychology, that you really have to kind of build your own happiness and your own meaning. So that's where Yalom and maybe Kurt Schneider would stretch out more into, particularly Schneider, the sense of awe and spiritual engagement, and the kind of practices that take you out of the constrictions of fear and some of those big existential questions.
Thank you so much for your answer, and thank you, Shannon, for the question. That's a really interesting, almost like an answer to nihilism, where people are like, "Oh, the world's meaningless. We're all gonna die. So what's the point?" I think that's an excellent answer where you can make meaning for yourself and find happiness through there.
Yeah, and just as a way of kind of addressing that very quickly. When I talk about Buddhism, there are different traditions in Buddhism, but the what's called the middle way is based on the idea of not falling into the extremes. Historically, this was the debate and the inquiry and the development of this middle way path of Buddhism, to not fall prey to nihilism, right, and negativism, or fall prey to theism, that there is some sort of, so this is just as an aside, very quick aside here, this is a bit of something that I think that really limited transpersonal psychology, certainly something that Wilber attacked, and other people have addressed, that somehow there's a naivete, that there is kind of a sense of spiritualism and metaphysics, and, well, not metaphysics per se, but theism, right? Religiosity to a transpersonal approach, because it presumes that somehow there's some great beyond that's perfect, and in the Buddhist teachings, nirvana is not a place. It's not like heaven in the Christian tradition. Nirvana is more about enlightenment, right? But the danger is that if you try to attach yourself to the idea of reaching nirvana, you trap yourself, right? And so that's sort of the core teaching. So that's a good point about nihilism, absolutely.
So the next question we have here, this is more career development oriented. So do you know of any opportunities for students interested in getting involved with therapy in correctional services?
I can't give you any really quick practical answers to that. I was on a panel at SFU. It was more of a career talk, and there was a woman who works in the correctional services. But what I remember her saying, this was a couple of years ago now, but there's a really high demand for people to come in terms of therapy and psychology and counseling in correctional services. So I'm sorry I can't direct you anything immediately, but I encourage you to look into, if that's your interest, to look into that, because I know there's demand there.
Thank you so much. I have another career-oriented question. So do you have any broad advice to offer to an undergraduate student looking to develop a career path in psychotherapy? So what sort of qualities are needed to be the most successful in this field? Really
good question. I was really shocked to get into the doctoral level. The education program, it wasn't an Ed.D. So my PhD is not an Ed.D. It's a philosophy degree, and in particular my stream was philosophy of education. So getting into the theory and practice of education, right down to the nitty-gritty, not studying so much curriculum, from a formal point of view, but for my personal approach was more addressing the formation of teachers as human beings, relationship between teachers and learners, or educators and learners, the learning environment. And I was really shocked being there with career educators. And I came in not at that point really being a school teacher and being a formal educator in that sense. And in the field, not so much at SFU, but in the broader education field, there's still really a preoccupation with the delivery of education, of curriculum, and as an information system and kind of a mass education model, and not coming from the other end, from the human side, right? And a lot of counseling programs are located in education faculties, which is also something I was quite fascinated to find out at SFU, not just in the psychology department, but in universities around the world. When you want to study counseling and not just psychology, you'll be in the education department. But again, not much focus on who is the emerging counselor. I taught a pre-counseling undergraduate course at SFU, and so it was a fascinating experience for me to be right there with someone asking the same questions. I might be interested in becoming a therapist or a counselor of some kind, but it was designed for people who maybe want to work at a crisis center, or just want to know how to do peer counseling in other areas of employment, right? But it was a very practice oriented class. There was some theory, but really it was get down to it, get into groups, sign up with a partner, and get into a counseling relationship. And they had to sign consent forms, and I was the supervisor for each pair and each group and for the course. And so my orientation going in was very much from the inside out, that this is the self-development point of view. This is the transpersonal point of view. It's reflective, it's introspective, it is immersed in the process of ongoing self-inquiry and through practice. And so to dive into an initial practice as neophytes, basically, like in this class, was terrifying to a lot of the students because they're talking about real things with each other. And so I laid out the fundamentals of what it means to be a non-judgmental listener, which is the model. And the whole idea is the basic practice, which is true all the way through to the most sophisticated kind of therapy, is you don't lead people into corners. You don't interrogate them. You want to open a conversation and draw out what the person needs to say to empower them to have their own realizations, right? So it's a co-emergent process, and we got off right away, pretty much after the second class. Most of the class was them sitting on camera, by the way. They were videoing this, and then they had to evaluate themselves and each other on video. And so we would do a group conversation, and by the third or fourth class, I said, how's it going? Does anyone have feedback? And most of the students said, we're having a really hard time. And I said, okay, what's difficult? And they said, well, we feel like we're not getting it. And I said, well, what do you mean? What is it? And they said, well, my partner's broken up with their romantic partner, addiction, or real stuff. And I don't know what to do. And I feel like I'm not helping them, and they're sitting there and falling apart in front of me. And I said, well, we're working through the text of the course, and you're not supposed to do anything. You're supposed to just keep making possible the intimate relationship that allows for them to feel safe, to explore and see what comes out. And so they just said, well, the presumption is like, well, we're missing something. It's easy for you to say you have all the experience, but how are we supposed to get that right away? And so it occurred to me to ask this question. Why is that so hard? Why is it so hard for you to think that there's some trick that I've got up my sleeve that I'm not telling you, and I'm sabotaging you in your group practice here, to fall on your faces and fail your client. Why is it you think that simply listening non-judgmentally, like a meditation, right, with oneself, is not enough? And so some of them, took a stab at it and came up with reasonable answers, but they're not the one that really satisfied the question. And then I stumbled on the answer, which was because you never experienced it. That in the moment of actually sitting down to do this work, you encounter your own stuff. And so that's the work that you need to do. So I think it's always, always critical in any field, but particularly in therapy, to dedicate and find the right teachers and the right practices that have this introspective or have a reflective element to them, so that you're always in touch with, first of all, what your intention is, and that you're going to be part of the process, right? Because the whole education system is about training experts, but we're human beings, right? We come into it already loaded.
All right, thank you so much for your answer. And that is our time for today. I'd like to give a huge thank you to you, Dr. Gordon, for taking the time to come onto our event, give your presentation, and then finally answer all of our questions. And I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today on this Friday night, Friday afternoon. I'm sure you're all very busy going into the weekend. So thank every one of you for making this event possible. The Expert Talk series is a bi-weekly event, so stay tuned for more information. Let's quickly go to, we had so many questions, but not enough time. So hopefully maybe in the future, we'll have Dr. Gordon on again, and he can answer even more of your guys' questions. Thank you all for coming. You can see our social media outlets here. Stay tuned on them for more information about when our next events will be. And yeah, have a great weekend, everyone.